Dr. Preston Harlow dropped the chart on the nurse's station counter like it was trash he was done carrying. He didn't look back. He didn't slow down. "Move him to palliative," he said, his voice flat, almost bored. "He's already dead. He just doesn't know it yet." 20 doctors had walked into room 14 over the past 6 days, 20 of the most respected physicians in Mercy General Hospital. And every single one of them had walked back out, chart in hand, defeat written across their faces, moving on to patients they believed they could actually save. The man lying in that bed had survived 3 combat deployments, 2 ambushes, and a sniper's bullet that had grazed his skull at 400 yards. But tonight it seemed like the American medical system was going to finish what enemy fire could not. At the far end of the hallway, a young nurse looked up from her clipboard. Her name was Rowan Hale. She had been a nurse for exactly 7 months, and she had a very different idea about what was going to happen next. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. And drop a comment right now telling us what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's get back to Rowan Hale, because what she did next is going to stay with you for a long time. The first time Rowan Hale laid eyes on Ethan Cross, he was unconscious, hooked to 3 separate monitors, and surrounded by the quiet hum of machines that were doing most of his living for him. She had been assigned to his room almost by accident, a scheduling error that the charge nurse hadn't bothered to fix. In this hospital, room 14 had become something of a ghost posting. The nurses didn't want it, the doctors avoided it, and the administrators had already started the paperwork to transfer him out of the ICU and into a quieter wing where the goal shifted from saving people to making their final hours comfortable. Rowan pulled her clipboard to her chest and stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside. He was a big man. Even lying flat in a hospital bed, even pale and hooked to every machine they had, he looked like someone who had been built for something harder than this. His hands were calloused. His jaw was set even in sleep, like he was still on guard. There was a thick scar running from just below his left ear down to the edge of his collarbone, old enough that it had faded silver. And there was the newer wound, the one that had brought him here, a head trauma so severe that the admitting team had initially called it unsurvivable. Rowan checked his chart. She read it slowly. She read it twice. Then she pulled a chair to the side of his bed and sat down. The monitors beeped steadily. His breathing was shallow but even. She noted the rhythm, noted the numbers, and then she noticed something the chart hadn't mentioned. Something small, something easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. His left hand had moved. It wasn't much, a twitch maybe, the slight curl of 2 fingers against the mattress. But Rowan had been watching, and she had seen it, and she felt the back of her neck go cold in the way it did when something important was happening that other people were about to miss. She leaned closer. "Hey," she said softly. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. She waited. "My name is Rowan. I'm your nurse tonight. You don't have to do anything. I just want you to know someone's here." The monitor beeped. The ventilator pushed. The room was quiet. She stayed anyway. She was still sitting there 40 minutes later when the charge nurse Linda Farrow appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by anything. "Hale, what are you doing?" "Watching his response patterns," Rowan said. "He doesn't have response patterns. He's in a persistent vegetative." He moved his hand. Linda's expression didn't change. "Spontaneous motor reflex. It happens. It doesn't mean anything." It happened twice, and it was the same hand both times. Same 2 fingers. "Rowan," Linda lowered her voice the way people do when they're trying to be kind but are running out of patience. "Dr. Harlow has already reviewed this case. The neurology team reviewed it. The attending reviewed it. This man has diffuse axonal injury across 3 lobes. There is no meaningful... Has anyone tried talking to him?" The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. Linda looked at her for a long moment. "Get back to your other patients. He's being moved to palliative in the morning." She left. Rowan didn't. She sat back down. She picked up his chart again, and she started reading every note, every scan, result, every lab value from the beginning, going back to the moment Ethan Cross had been brought through the emergency doors 6 days ago with a GCS score of 4 and a neurosurgeon who had told the admitting team quietly in the hallway that they were looking at a formality, not a treatment. Her pen moved across her notepad. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. She only knew she hadn't found it yet. The second time his fingers moved, she was ready. She was writing. He shifted. Two fingers, left hand pressing down against the sheet with something that felt even to her like intention. She set her pen down immediately. She put her hand close to his, not touching, just near. "Ethan," she said, "not Mr., not Sir, his name. Can you squeeze nothing for 10 seconds?" Then his fingers closed slowly, weakly around two of hers. Rowan's breath stopped. She looked at the monitor. His heart rate had ticked up by 8 beats per minute. She looked back at his face. His eyes were still closed. His expression hadn't changed, but his hand was holding hers, and it was not a reflex. Reflexes didn't discriminate. Reflexes didn't reach. She pressed the call button. Linda appeared in under a minute. "What is it?" He responded to his name. Purposeful grip. Left hand sustained for approximately 4 seconds. Linda stared at her. "Hale, I documented the time and the stimulus. I want to request a repeat neurological assessment. The neurology team was here yesterday. Then I want them back today." Something moved behind Linda's eyes. It wasn't quite irritation. It was closer to the look of someone who had seen young nurses burn themselves out on hopeless cases before and didn't know how to stop this one from doing the same. "I'll pass it along," she said, which both of them knew meant she wouldn't. Rowan waited until she was gone. Then she took out her personal phone, opened her notes app, and started logging everything herself. Timestamp, stimulus, response, response, duration. She would have the documentation whether anyone asked for it or not. By 2 in the morning, Rowan had 3 pages of notes on Ethan Cross. By 3, she had cross-referenced his medication regimen against 3 separate clinical studies she pulled from her phone during her break. By 4, she had found something. She almost missed it. It was buried in the pharmacology notes, a combination of 2 sedative medications that in standard doses were completely ordinary. In combination with a specific enzyme deficiency that appeared once briefly in Ethan's blood work from day 2, they produced a metabolic profile that could, in a very particular subset of patients, mimic the clinical presentation of vegetative state. Suppressed responsiveness, minimal voluntary motor activity, the appearance of irreversible neurological damage in a patient who might be something other than irretrievably gone. It was not a guaranteed answer. It was a question. But it was a question no one had asked. She stared at the screen of her phone. She stared at her notes. She looked at the man in the bed, at the rise and fall of his chest, at the hand that had held hers 4 seconds ago in the dark. She thought about Dr. Harlow and his flat, bored voice. Already dead. He just doesn't know it yet. She thought about 20 doctors walking out of this room. She thought about the palliative transfer scheduled for 6 a.m. Then she put her phone in her pocket, straightened her scrubs, and went to find the on-call physician. His name was Dr. Yusuf Okafor, and he was 34 years old, 7 years out of residency, and currently asleep in the on-call room with a coffee cup still in his hand. He opened the door at her knock and looked at her with the resigned patience of someone who had accepted that sleep was theoretical. "What is it, Hale?" "Room 14, Ethan Cross. I need you to look at something." He blinked. "Harlow's patient?" "Yes." Okafor looked at her for a moment. He knew the case. Everyone knew the case. "Harlow's already?" "I know what Harlow said. I'm asking you to look at something specific in his blood work, in his current med list, before he gets transferred out at 6. Something in her voice must have reached him. Not desperation. She wasn't desperate. She was precise, and there was a difference, and Okafor was good enough to hear it. He set the coffee cup down. "Give me 2 minutes." She gave him 1. They stood together in the hallway outside room 14, and Rowan walked him through it. She showed him the enzyme flag in the day 2 labs. She showed him the pharmacology notes. She showed him the 3 studies. She showed him her own documentation, the timestamps, the stimuli, the responses. Okafor read quietly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't dismiss her. He just read. And somewhere in the middle of her second page of notes, she saw his jaw tighten. "This enzyme deficiency," he said carefully. "Was it flagged at admission?" "No." "Has anyone ordered a repeat panel since?" "No." He looked at the door to room 14. "And you said purposeful grip, not reflex. Sustained 4 seconds, responsive to name stimulus, same hand both times. I documented every instance." Okafor was quiet for a long moment. She could see him thinking. She could see him calculating something that had nothing to do with medicine. The political weight of questioning Harlow, of reopening a case that the chief of medicine had personally closed, of being a 34-year-old on-call physician who was about to walk into a situation that could go very badly for him professionally if he was wrong. She held her breath. "I'm going to need to examine him myself," Okafor said. She let the breath out. They went in together. Okafor was thorough, more thorough than she expected. He spent 20 minutes at Ethan's bedside running through a full neurological assessment with the kind of quiet intensity that told her he was taking this seriously, not humoring her. He checked reflexes. He checked eye response. He spoke to Ethan directly. He waited. Ethan's fingers moved for Okafor too. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in movies. Just that same slow, deliberate curl, two fingers pressing down. But when Okafor said, "Ethan, squeeze my hand," something happened that made the air in the room change. Ethan Cross, who 20 doctors had declared functionally gone, squeezed back. Okafor straightened up. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the chart. He looked at Rowan. He looked back at the chart. "I'm ordering a repeat metabolic panel," he said, "and I'm holding the palliative transfer. Dr. Harlow's going to push back. He very likely is." He handed her back her notes. "Document everything. Everything, hail, every time, every response, every timestamp. If this goes where I think it might be going, we are going to need every word of this to be airtight." He left the room already on his phone. Rowan pulled her chair back to the side of Ethan's bed. She sat down. She picked up her pen. She looked at the man who had been written off by everyone in this building, who had survived wars and ambushes and a bullet to the skull, only to be defeated almost by a lab flag that no one had bothered to check twice. "You held on," she said quietly. "You kept holding on. Now I need you to keep doing that a little bit longer." The monitor beeped. His chest rose and fell, and then so slowly she almost missed it. The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, not quite, but something close enough that her throat tightened and she had to press her lips together and look at the ceiling for a second before she could write down the timestamp. She had barely gotten the numbers down when the door swung open. It wasn't Linda. It wasn't Okafor. It was Dr. Preston Harlow in his street clothes, which meant someone had called him at home, which meant someone had told him what was happening before Okafor had even left the floor, and which meant that what happened next was not going to be quiet. He looked at her. He looked at the room. He looked at the vitals monitor, at the documentation clipboard she was holding, and his face went through several things in rapid succession: surprise, recognition, and then something that settled into something hard. "Who authorized a repeat metabolic panel on this patient?" he said. Rowan stood up. "Dr. Okafor ordered it, sir." "Okafor is on call. He doesn't have the authority to overturn a consulting team's determination without running it through me first. He's the attending physician on duty. I am the chief of medicine." Harlow's voice was very controlled. "And I have reviewed this case personally. This patient has diffuse irreversible—" He responded to his name 40 minutes ago. "Purposeful grip." Dr. Okafor witnessed it. The silence that followed that sentence was different from the one that had followed it with Linda. Linda's silence had been exhaustion. Harlow's silence was something colder. Spontaneous motor activity does not indicate. It happened 3 times. Responsive to verbal stimulus. Same hand, same 2 fingers, sustained. I have timestamps going back 6 hours. Harlow looked at the clipboard in her hand. He did not ask to see it. "You're a first-year nurse," he said. 7 months, she said. "You have no clinical basis to challenge a determination made by— I have documented evidence of purposeful response in a patient currently scheduled for palliative transfer at 6 a.m. I showed it to the on-call physician. He agreed it warranted further evaluation." She kept her voice even, perfectly even. "I'm not challenging anything, Dr. Harlow. I'm doing my job." He looked at her for a long time. She did not look away. "If this panel comes back normal," he said, "I will personally ensure that your supervisor reviews your conduct tonight for inappropriate overreach." "Understood," she said. He left. Rowan sat back down. Her hands were not shaking. She was mildly surprised by that. She set her clipboard on her knee, found the next line on her notepad, and wrote down the time. Then she looked at Ethan Cross. "You've got about an hour before those results come back," she said, "and I need you to still be in there." His chest rose. His chest fell. Outside the door, the hospital hummed with the ordinary sounds of night, the distant beep of monitors, the soft footsteps of the overnight staff, the low murmur of a call being made somewhere down the hall. Inside room 14, Rowan Hale sat in her chair, her pen in her hand, her notes spread on her knee, and she waited. She was good at waiting. She had learned in 7 months that the hardest part of this job was not the emergency. It was the quiet before it, the long still minutes, when nothing had been decided yet, and the outcome was still sitting somewhere just out of reach, and all you could do was hold your ground and refuse to let go. She had refused to let go of him all night. She wasn't about to start now. The lab results were due in 47 minutes. 47 minutes felt like a very long time. And then the monitor beeped differently, not an alarm, just a shift in rhythm, subtle enough that only someone who had been watching it for hours would notice. And Rowan leaned forward, eyes fixed on the screen pen already moving. Because something was changing. And she was the only one in this building who had been paying close enough attention to see it. The monitor beeped differently, and Rowan was already on her feet before the sound fully registered. It wasn't an alarm. It wasn't a code. It was something subtler than that, a variation in the rhythm she had been watching for the past 6 hours, a small but unmistakable shift in the pattern that told her the numbers on that screen were no longer holding steady. She crossed the room in 3 steps, checked the readout, and felt something tighten in her chest that she refused to let become panic. His blood pressure had dropped. Not critically, not yet, but it was moving in the wrong direction, and it was moving there faster than it should have been. She hit the call button and reached for his chart at the same time. Linda appeared in the doorway in under 90 seconds, took one look at the monitor, and then looked at Rowan with an expression that had gone from dismissal to something closer to attention. What happened? Pressure dropped. 12 points systolic in the last 4 minutes. I need Okafor back in here. Okafor is with a patient in, then get him between patients. Now Linda. Something in her voice landed. Linda was already on her radio. Rowan stayed at the bedside. She kept her eyes on the monitor and her hand close to Ethan's wrist, tracking his pulse directly beneath her fingers because she didn't want to trust the machine alone. His pulse was there. It was thin, but it was there and it was steady, and she held onto that steadiness like it was something she could keep in place through sheer will. Come on, she said under her breath. You've been fighting for 6 days. Don't stop now. Okafor came through the door 4 minutes later, still pulling on his stethoscope. He took one look at the monitor, one look at Rowan's face, and moved directly to the bed. He didn't ask her what happened. He just started assessing fast and methodical the way she had seen him work, before quiet, efficient, no wasted motion. When did it start dropping, he asked. About 6 minutes ago. Gradual at first, then it accelerated. Any change in his breathing pattern? Slightly shallower, still above threshold. Okafor listened to his chest. He checked his pupils. He straightened up and his face was doing the thing where it went very still and very careful, which she had learned meant he was thinking through something he didn't like. It could be a vascular response, he said, consistent with what we'd see if the medication theory holds the body starting to process differently once we adjusted the sedative dosage. You already adjusted it. 40 minutes ago, I put in a quiet order before Harlow showed up. He glanced at the door. Which means if this is what I think it is, it's actually a good sign, an adjustment response, his system reacting to a change. Rowan looked at the monitor. A good sign that looks exactly like him crashing. Yes, he didn't sugarcoat it, which is why I need you to watch him like a hawk for the next 30 minutes. Any further drop below 90 systolic, you call a rapid response immediately, regardless of what Harlow says, regardless of what anyone says. You call it. And if it stabilizes, then we wait for the lab results and we have the most important conversation of this man's medical care. He looked at the bed, at Ethan, at the still face and the calloused hands, and the machines breathing for a man who had apparently been breathing for himself this whole time in ways no one had measured correctly. He moved for you, Hale. He moved for me. That is not nothing. I know it's not. Okafor left. Rowan stayed. The next 22 minutes were the longest of her 7-month career. She sat at the bedside with her eyes moving between Ethan's face and the monitor in a rhythm so constant it felt like a physical thing, like a pendulum she was keeping in motion by watching it. The pressure held at a low number. Not stable exactly, but not falling further either. Hovering in a narrow band that was technically acceptable and practically terrifying. She logged every minute. She noted every variation. She talked to him low and steady, not because she was sure he could hear her, but because the alternative was silence, and silence felt like giving up. "You were a sniper," she said. "I read the intake notes. They listed your service record. 3 deployments. I don't know the whole story, but I know enough to know that if you survived all of that, you did not survive it by accident." She kept her voice quiet, conversational, the way you talk to someone you're trying to keep tethered. "You made choices out there. Probably 100 choices a day that kept you alive when they didn't have to. And I'm asking you to make one more, just one. Stay here, stay with me." The monitor held, his fingers didn't move, but his pulse beneath her fingers stayed. At 4:47 in the morning, her pager went off. Lab results. She pulled it up on the terminal at his bedside and read the numbers twice and then stood completely still for 5 seconds, while something that felt very much like vindication moved through her chest. The enzyme panel confirmed it. The deficiency was real, measurable, clinically significant, and it had been sitting in his blood work since day 2, unflagged, overlooked, filed away in a chart that no one had gone back to read carefully enough. And in combination with the sedative regimen, he'd been on a perfectly standard regimen for a patient in his supposed condition. The metabolic picture it created was, as she had theorized, one that mimicked the presentation of irreversible neurological damage. She was already dialing Okafor's extension. He picked up on the first ring. He'd been waiting. "Tell me." "Confirmed. Enzyme deficiency flagged in the panel. Values are consistent with the pharmacological interaction I identified." The pause on the other end of the line lasted exactly 3 seconds. "I'll be there in 5 minutes, Okafor said. "And Hale, don't let anyone move him anywhere until I'm back in that room." She hung up and turned around. Dr. Preston Harlow was standing in the doorway. She didn't know how long he had been there. She didn't know if he had heard the call. But he was looking at her with an expression that was very composed and very careful, and she had learned in the past few hours that composure from Harlow was not a sign of calm. It was a sign of a man organizing a response. "The transfer team is here," he said. "There's a hold on the transfer," she said. "Dr. Okafor ordered it." "Dr. Okafor is on call. The transfer was authorized by my office. It supersedes, the lab results are back." She kept her voice level, completely level. "They confirm a metabolic abnormality consistent with the pharmacological interaction I flagged. This patient's clinical presentation may not reflect an accurate neurological prognosis." The words landed in the room and sat there. Harlow looked at the terminal. He looked at her. He said slowly, "You ordered lab work on my patient without—" "Dr. Okafor ordered the lab work on a patient currently under active care in this hospital." She met his eyes. "The results indicate this man may have been responding to a treatable condition this entire time. One enzyme panel does not." He squeezed Dr. Okafor's hand at 3:42 this morning. "I have it documented. Okafor witnessed it. If you transfer this patient to palliative care with this information on the record and without a neurological reevaluation, that decision will be on the record too." It was the most direct thing she had ever said to a physician in her career. Her voice did not shake. Her hands did not shake. But something in the room shifted in a way she felt in her sternum, because Preston Harlow was not a man who was accustomed to being checked by anyone, least of all a 7-month nurse at 4 in the morning who was running on no sleep and nothing but conviction. He stepped into the room. He walked to the terminal. He looked at the lab results himself. She watched his face. She saw the moment he read the enzyme values. She saw his jaw shift. She saw his eyes move to Ethan Cross in the bed, and then back to the screen, and then something complicated moved through his expression that she couldn't fully name. Not guilt, not yet, but something that sat in the neighborhood of it. Okafor arrived. He came in fast, saw Harlow, and slowed by exactly 1 step before recovering. He looked at Rowan. She tilted her head toward the terminal. He moved to it, read the results, and then straightened in a way that added about an inch to his height. "Preston," he said. "Not Dr. Harlow, Preston. I need to request an emergency neurology consult. Given these results, I believe we have a clinically significant basis to reevaluate this patient's prognosis before any disposition decisions are made." Harlow said nothing. "I'm also recommending an immediate modification to his sedative protocol pending that consult." Okafor's voice was very calm, the calmness of a man who has decided something and is now simply executing it. If this enzyme interaction is producing the suppressive effect Nurse Hale identified, reducing those medications could produce observable changes in his responsiveness within hours. Harlow turned from the terminal and looked at both of them. "If you're wrong," he said, "this patient endures unnecessary interventions in his final hours, which is its own category of harm. And if we're right," Rowan said, "he gets to live." The words sat in the air between them. Live, Harlow looked at Ethan Cross one more time, at the monitors, at the chart. And then he said in a voice that had lost something, not its authority exactly, but its certainty, "I want the neurology consult documented as my order, and I want full documentation of every finding that led to this reevaluation." He left without another word. Rowan exhaled. Okafor looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that the moment hadn't already said better. He went to Ethan's bedside and began the protocol adjustment. She stood beside him, handing him what he needed before he asked for it, the two of them working in the quiet synchrony that develops between people who have just fought for something together. "How did you know?" Okafor asked, not looking up from what he was doing. "I didn't," she said. "I just didn't know that I was wrong." He glanced at her. "That's not nothing either." The next 2 hours moved in a different kind of silence. Not the silence of waiting for the worst, but the silence of watching for something good, which was harder in its own way because hope was heavier than dread. Dread you could brace against. Hope required you to stay open, and staying open hurt. She watched the monitor. She watched his face. She kept her notes. She talked to him between the clinical observations, low and steady, filling the room with the sound of a voice that was staying regardless. At 6:19 in the morning, Dr. Angela Reyes from neurology arrived. She was 61 years old, had been chief of neuro for 11 years, and she walked into room 14 with the particular energy of someone who had received an urgent consult at an inconvenient hour and was therefore either going to be very impressed or very annoyed within the next 10 minutes. She read the chart, she read Rowan's documentation, she read the lab results. Then she put on her gloves, moved to the bedside and said, "Ethan, my name is Dr. Reyes. I'm going to do a quick examination. If you can hear me, I'd like you to squeeze my hand." The room held its breath. 6 seconds, 7, 8, and then his hand moved. Not weakly, not ambiguously. His fingers closed around Dr. Reyes's hand with the slow but unmistakable grip of a man who was still in there, who had been in there the whole time fighting in the only way available to him, quietly and visibly in the dark. Dr. Reyes stood up. She looked at the chart. She looked at Rowan. She said, "When was the sedative protocol last modified?" 2 hours and 14 minutes ago, Rowan said, and the enzyme results were confirmed when 4:47 a.m. Reyes nodded slowly. She made a notation in the chart. Then she looked up and said very precisely, "I want a full neurocognitive assessment as soon as he's responsive enough to participate. I'm suspending the palliative order, and I want daily consultations until I personally determine his prognosis." She looked at Okafor. "Who was the attending who signed the original palliative directive?" The silence that followed that question had a very particular shape to it. "It was a collaborative determination," Okafor said carefully. Reyes looked at him for a moment. "I see." She made another notation. "I'll want to review the original assessment notes in full." She turned to leave, then paused at the door and looked back, not at Okafor, not at the chart, but at Rowan. "Good catch, nurse." She left. Rowan set her pen down. She had not realized how hard she had been holding it until she let it go. The day shift began arriving at 7. She heard them in the hallway, the changing of hands, the ordinary sounds of a hospital resuming its ordinary rhythms. She should have handed off and gone home. She had been on for 11 hours. Her feet were numb and her eyes felt like they were made of something solid, and there was a particular kind of exhaustion that came from fighting for something all night that was different from regular tiredness. It sat in your bones, not just your muscles. She stayed until 7:30. She stayed because at 7:20 something happened that she had not let herself believe would happen, not fully, not yet, even with all of it, the lab results and Okafor's witness and Reyes's consult and the palliative order suspended. Ethan Cross opened his eyes. Not fully, not dramatically. It was the slow, effortful opening of eyes that had been closed for 6 days, the kind of opening that cost something that you could see taking the effort, the lids lifting by degrees, like something heavy being moved by someone who had been using everything they had just to get here. He looked at the ceiling first. Then slowly he turned his head. He looked at Rowan. His eyes were brown. She hadn't known that. It wasn't in the chart. They were brown and they were unfocused, and there were layers of confusion and medication and 6 days of darkness behind them, but they were open and they were looking at her, and that was the whole thing. That was all of it. She leaned forward. "Hey," she said, the same words she had used at the very beginning, the first thing she had ever said to him. "Can you hear me?" His mouth moved. No sound came out, but his mouth moved like someone trying to remember how words worked, like someone surfacing from a very long depth. And then he blinked once slowly and deliberately. And that blink, that single, purposeful, voluntary blink, was the most significant thing she had ever witnessed in 7 months of nursing. She pressed the call button. She kept her voice steady when she spoke into it. "This is Hale in room 14. I need Dr. Okafor and Dr. Reyes paged immediately. Patient is demonstrating purposeful eye-opening and voluntary motor response." She released the button. She looked at Ethan. "You came back," she said, and her voice held mostly. "Mostly. I told you to keep holding on. You kept holding on." He blinked again, one slow, deliberate blink. She took that as a yes. Down the hall, she could already hear footsteps accelerating. She could hear a page going out over the intercom. Okafor's name, Rhea's name, urgent but controlled the sound of a hospital pivoting towards something that had shifted from inevitable to impossible to something that didn't have a name yet, but was happening anyway right here, right now in room 14, where a 7-month nurse had sat through the night and refused to let a man be erased. Rowan Hale picked up her pen. She found the next line on her notepad. She wrote the time, and she kept watching. Okafor arrived first, 30 seconds ahead of Reyes, and he stopped at the threshold of room 14, the way people stop when they're trying to absorb something their eyes are telling them that their training hasn't fully prepared them for. Ethan Cross was awake, not lucid, not speaking, not anywhere close to the man he had been before 6 days in this bed, but awake and looking and present in the room in a way that was categorically different from everything that had come before it. Okafor crossed to the bedside. He leaned in, voice low and even. "Ethan, I'm Dr. Okafor. You're at Mercy General. You're safe. Can you follow my finger?" Ethan's eyes moved, slowly, imprecisely, but they moved. Okafor exhaled through his nose and said nothing for a moment. Then he turned to Rowan and said, "Go home, Hale." "I'm fine. You've been on for 11 hours. You've done what you came to do. Go home." She looked at Ethan. His eyes had drifted back to the ceiling, unfocused again. The effort of tracking apparently more than he could sustain for more than a few seconds. But he was there. He was there and he was holding, and the machines were not the only thing keeping him alive anymore, and she could feel that fact in her chest like something that had been wound very tight, finally releasing a single degree of tension. "I'll do handoff first," she said. "Of course you will," Okafor said, and there was something in his voice that might have been affection if either of them had the energy left to name it. Dr. Reyes arrived and went directly to work, her examination efficient and swift, and Rowan stood at the foot of the bed long enough to hear her say quietly to Okafor, "This is not the presentation of irreversible diffuse axonal injury. I want a full imaging series within the hour." Then Rowan did her handoff, walked to the locker room, sat down on the bench, and stared at the floor for approximately 3 minutes before she was capable of changing her shoes. She drove home in the early light of a morning that felt different from the one she had driven to work in, though she couldn't have articulated exactly why. She fell asleep with her phone on the pillow beside her, which was not something she normally did. She was back at the hospital 14 hours later. Not because her shift started. Her shift didn't start for another 6 hours. She came back because she had woken up at 8 in the evening, and the first thing she had thought about was the imaging series, and whether the results had come in, and whether Ethan Cross was still holding on, and she had tried for 40 minutes to not come back and failed. She stopped at the nurse's station first. The evening charge nurse was a man named Dennis, who had been at Mercy General for 19 years, and had seen enough that very little surprised him anymore. He looked up when she walked in, recognized her face, and said without preamble, "Room 14, you'll want to see it yourself." She walked down the hall. She stopped at the door. Ethan Cross was awake. Not the fragile, effortful wakefulness of 7:20 in the morning, not the slow blinking of a man barely surfacing. He was sitting up at an angle, the bed raised behind him, and his eyes were open and tracking, and when she stepped through the door, he turned his head and looked directly at her. His voice came out rough and low and barely above a whisper, which was to be expected after 6 days on a ventilator, and what he said was this. "You're the one who talked to me." Rowan stood very still. "You heard me." "Not all of it," he swallowed. The effort was visible. "Pieces. Your voice, you were always there." She walked to the chair beside his bed. Her chair, the one she had sat in for 11 straight hours, and she sat down. She set her bag on the floor. She looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there are some moments that don't need to be filled. Then she said, "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a building." A pause. "What happened to me?" "You were brought in 6 days ago, head trauma. You've been in the ICU." "I know that part." His eyes were clearer than she expected. Behind the exhaustion, behind the rawness of a man who had just come back from a very long away, there was a particular quality of alertness that she recognized from his intake notes. The kind you didn't acquire in a classroom. "I mean, what happened in here while I was out?" She considered what to tell him and how much. "You had a medication interaction that no one caught right away. It was making you look worse than you were." He was quiet for a moment, processing that. "How bad did it get?" She met his eyes. "Pretty bad." He seemed to understand what that meant. "How long did it take someone to catch it?" She paused. "Tell me straight," he said. "I've been in situations where people sugarcoat things to protect me, and it always costs more than the truth." 6 days, she said. "You were scheduled for palliative care this morning." The word landed. She watched him take it in, watched him do the math of what that meant, where he had been, how close it had been, what the word palliative attached to a man who was 43 years old and still breathing meant in a hospital context. He didn't flinch, but something moved behind his eyes that was not quite calm. "Who caught it?" he asked. She opened her mouth. "It was you," he said before she could answer. Not a question. "I flagged some lab results. Dr. Okafor, was it you or not?" She closed her mouth. Then she said yes. He looked at her for a long time. She held it. She had gotten good at holding things. "Thank you," he said. Just that. But the way he said it, direct, without ornamentation, the way a man says something he means down to the marrow, made the hair on her arm stand up. "I was doing my job," she said. "No," he said quietly. "You were doing something more than that. I've been in enough situations to know the difference." She didn't have an answer for that. She was saved from needing one by the sound of footsteps in the hallway, and then Dr. Reyes was in the doorway, chart in hand, and she looked at Rowan with an expression that had several things in it simultaneously. "Nurse Hale," she said, "you're not on shift." "I know." Reyes looked at her for a beat, then at Ethan. "How is your pain level right now on a scale of 4, Ethan said. "Maybe 5. I've had worse." "I don't doubt it." She moved to the bedside, efficient and professional. "Your imaging results came back this afternoon. The good news is that the diffuse injury pattern we were concerned about is significantly less extensive than the initial assessment indicated. There is some damage in the temporal region that we'll need to monitor, and there will be a period of recovery that I won't minimize. It will take work and it will take time, but the trajectory is not what it looked like 24 hours ago." She looked at him directly. "You have a functional prognosis, Mr. Cross. A real one." He absorbed that. He nodded once. "What's the realistic timeline for getting out of here?" "That depends on how your system responds over the next 72 hours. If you continue on this trajectory," she paused, "you're already well ahead of where you should be, frankly." "I had motivation," he said. His eyes moved briefly to Rowan. Reyes followed his gaze. She looked at Rowan with an expression that had sharpened into something evaluative. "I've been reviewing the documentation from last night," she said. "All of it. The timestamps, the clinical observations, the pharmacological cross-reference." She paused. "Do you have a background in pharmacology specifically?" "That level of analysis is not standard for a nurse 7 months out of training." "I read a lot," Rowan said. "Apparently." Reyes made a notation in the chart. "I've been at this hospital for 11 years. I've seen nurses who were exceptional clinicians, and I've seen nurses who were competent administrators, and I've seen very few who were both. What you did last night was both." She looked at Rowan steadily. "I'm going to be speaking with nursing administration about your case. I want that documented properly. She left the room without further ceremony. That was Rowan was learning simply how Reyes operated. Ethan Cross was watching her. Angela Reyes does not say things like that, he said. You know her. My sister was a patient here 3 years ago. Reyes was her neurologist. Something moved through his expression. She told my sister's husband very precisely that his wife was going to recover fully, and she was right. She doesn't say things she isn't sure of. Rowan nodded. She looked at her hands. What's your name? He asked. Rowan. Rowan Hale. How long have you been a nurse? 7 months. He was quiet for a moment. 7 months, he repeated the way you repeat something when the number doesn't quite accommodate everything you're trying to hold inside it. Almost 8, she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't much, but she recognized it because she had seen it once before in the dark at 4 in the morning when she had been the only person in the building paying attention. Then the door opened and everything shifted. The man who walked in was broad-shouldered and wore a jacket with a federal insignia on the breast, and behind him came a second man in a suit who was either a lawyer or had recently taken lessons from one. They both looked at Ethan with the specific expression of men who had been waiting for this moment and were now recalculating something they hadn't expected to need to recalculate, which was specifically that Ethan Cross was awake, conscious, and looking back at them. The man in the jacket said, Mr. Cross, I'm Agent Dillard, Defense Intelligence. This is Mr. Parrish from the JAG office. We've been waiting for you to be available. Ethan's expression didn't change, but something in it settled into a flatness that was completely different from the man who had been talking to Rowan 30 seconds ago. How long have you been in the building? We arrived this morning, Dillard said. We were informed this morning that you had regained consciousness. What do you want? Dillard glanced at Rowan. We'd prefer to speak with you privately. She stays, Ethan said. Dillard looked at Ethan, at Rowan, back at Ethan. Mr. Cross, this is a classified. She stays or you don't talk, Ethan said. And his voice, rough and quiet as it was, had something in it that ended discussions. Rowan had met men who had that quality, and they had all been the same kind of man, the kind who had been in places where a certain tone of voice was the only thing standing between decision and consequence. Dillard adjusted his approach. We need to discuss the circumstances of your injury, he said, specifically the mission that preceded your hospitalization. I know what mission preceded my hospitalization, Ethan said. There are elements of that mission that have become complicated. Since your incapacitation, there have been developments. Regarding your team, something changed in Ethan's face, subtle but significant. What kind of developments? 2 members of your unit have been taken into custody, pending investigation into a significant breach of operational protocol. Parrish, the lawyer, spoke for the first time. His voice was clipped and precise. The circumstances around your injury are now part of an active inquiry. We need a statement from you as soon as you're cleared for interview. Ethan was very still. Taken into custody for what specifically? That's not something we can discuss in Dillard. The way Ethan said it flat direct, the way you say the name of someone you've dealt with before in rooms that weren't this comfortable made the agent stop. I have been lying in this bed for 6 days. Whatever you're not telling me, I'm going to find out in the next 24 hours regardless. So either tell me now or get out of this room and come back when you're prepared to have an actual conversation. Dillard looked at Parrish. Parrish gave a small nod. We have reason to believe, Dillard said carefully, that your injury may not have been entirely the result of enemy contact. The room was very quiet. Rowan watched Ethan's face and saw him process those words with the particular stillness of someone who had suspected something for a long time and was now receiving confirmation that the suspicion was real. It was not the shock of a surprise. It was the weight of something you'd been carrying finally being named out loud. Who, he said. 1 word. That's what the inquiry is. I said who. Mr. Cross, we are not at liberty to. Get out, Ethan said. Both of you, get out of this room and don't come back until you're ready to talk to me like I'm not a liability you're managing. Dillard opened his mouth. Now, Ethan said. They left. The door swung shut behind them and the room went quiet again. But it was a different quiet from before, heavier charged with something that hadn't been in the room 30 seconds ago. Rowan looked at Ethan. He was staring at the ceiling, jaw set, and she could see him sorting through something internal that was large and complicated and had nothing to do with his blood pressure or his enzyme panel. I'm sorry, she said. I can leave if you need. Don't. He said it quickly, then softer, please don't. She stayed. After a long moment, he turned his head and looked at her. And the flatness that had come over his face when Dillard walked in had not entirely receded. But underneath it, she could see something else, something raw and tired and very human, that the operational mask was only half covering. 6 days, he said. 6 days I was in here, and someone out there was moving pieces around. You don't have to talk about it. I know I don't. He exhaled. I just spent 6 days in the dark while people decided what to do with me. I'm done with people deciding things about me without me in the room. She understood that. She understood it more specifically than she could say, because she had spent 11 hours of her own night fighting exactly that battle on his behalf, fighting against the decisions that were being made about him, over him, in hallways where he couldn't hear and couldn't respond and couldn't push back. You were fighting back, she said. Even then, you were squeezing hands and moving fingers and holding on. You were in the room. You never stopped being in the room. He looked at her. She hadn't meant to say all of that. It came out because it was true and because she was running on 14 hours of disrupted sleep and the particular emotional exposure that came from having fought for something all night and watched it come back to life. You're unusual, he said. You know that. I've been told I read too much. That got a real reaction, not quite a laugh. The machinery for laughing was still too raw, but something in the vicinity of one a breath that came out slightly differently than the others, and his eyes did something that was the precursor to a smile. It lasted about 3 seconds before his face changed again, because his phone, which someone had apparently retrieved from his personal effects and placed on the nightstand, was lit up with a notification, and he had seen it from the corner of his eye, and whatever was on that screen had taken whatever had just opened in his expression and closed it back down. He reached for the phone, read the screen, and then his jaw went tight in a way that she recognized from the very first time she had looked at his face, the set of him who had been built for alertness and whose body never fully let that go, not even unconscious, not even in crisis. What is it? She asked, because she could see that it was something. He turned the phone toward her. It was a news alert. 6 words in the headline, 6 words that explained why Dillard and Parrish had been in this hospital since this morning, why they had moved as fast as they had once word got out that Ethan Cross was conscious, and why the conversation that had just happened in this room was not going to be the last one. The headline read, SEAL team member found dead in Virginia, suspected foul play. Rowan read it twice. She looked at Ethan. Was he on your team? Yeah, Ethan said. His voice had gone completely flat. He was the one who was with me when I went down. The silence that followed was the kind that you don't fill. Outside the room, the hospital moved through its evening rhythms and down the hall. A monitor beeped its ordinary beep, and somewhere a door opened and closed, and the world continued its ordinary rotations. But inside room 14, something had shifted again, had shifted completely. And the story of Ethan Cross, which had started as a medical crisis, which had turned into a fight between a rookie nurse and a medical institution, which had turned into a miracle of the small and painstaking kind, had just expanded into something larger and more dangerous than anyone in this building had anticipated. Rowan looked at the phone. She looked at Ethan. What do you need? She asked. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said the thing that told her everything about who he was and how he thought and what he had been doing for however many years before he ended up in this bed. I need to know who put me here, he said. And I need to know before they figure out I'm awake enough to talk. The words hung in the air between them, and Rowan felt them settle into her chest with a weight that had nothing to do with medicine anymore. She looked at Ethan Cross at the hospital bed, at the monitors, at the man who had been unconscious and written off 48 hours ago, and was now looking at her with eyes that were entirely dangerously awake, and she made a decision in the space of about 4 seconds that she suspected she would be thinking about for a very long time afterward. Tell me what you know, she said. He studied her for a moment. The way he looked at people was direct without being aggressive, the look of someone who had been trained to read situations fast and had long since stopped doing it consciously. You're a nurse, he said, not dismissively, almost like a reminder to himself. I'm also the person who spent 11 hours last night keeping you alive when everyone else in this building had already filed the paperwork on you, she said. So if there's something happening that puts you back in danger, I'd like to know about it. Something shifted in his expression. He looked at the phone in his hand. He looked at the headline. Then he set the phone face down on the mattress and said, "His name was Marcus Webb. He was my spotter. Best in the unit. We'd been together for 4 deployments." She waited. "The mission that brought me here, we were on an extraction. Asset recovery, classified site Eastern Sector. Marcus and I were providing overwatch. Everything was clean for the first 2 hours. Then something changed." He paused, swallowed. The physical effort of speaking at length was still costing him, and she could see him managing it, rationing his energy the way men who've been trained in conservation do instinctively. "The asset changed hands before we were supposed to move. Someone on the ground gave a signal that wasn't in our brief. Marcus recognized it. He called it out on comms. And then 30 seconds later, my world went sideways." "You were shot." "I was hit," he said. "Whether it was enemy contact or something else, I had 4 seconds of consciousness after impact. Enough to know I was down, enough to know Marcus was still on comms, and enough to know that the last thing he said before I lost it was a name." He looked at her steadily. "A name that shouldn't have been in that sector. A name attached to someone who was supposed to be 300 miles away in a command position." Rowan understood what he was saying. Not all the operational details, those lived in a world she didn't have access to, but the shape of it, the structure. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there was there. Someone who should have been behind a desk was in the field. And within 6 days of that, Marcus Webb was dead, and Ethan Cross had nearly been quietly filed away into palliative care. "Dillard knows the name," Ethan said. "That's why he came. Not to investigate, to contain." "You think he's protecting whoever it is?" "I think someone sent him here to find out what I know before I'm coherent enough to tell anyone who isn't already in the circle." He shifted against the pillow, the movement pulling something that cost him. She saw it in the brief tightening around his eyes. "The 2 men they took into custody, Reyes and Carver, my team, they didn't breach protocol. They found something. And finding it is what got them arrested." Rowan sat back in the chair. She processed this with the same systematic attention she brought to lab results, not rushing to a conclusion, not panicking, just holding the information and letting it arrange itself into something usable. "How much time do you think you have before Dillard comes back with someone who outranks him?" "Hours, maybe less." He looked at the door. "They'll have someone watching this floor. Standard practice when an asset goes from unresponsive to awake." "An asset," she repeated. "That's what I am to them right now." He said it without bitterness, just precision. "The question is whether I'm an asset they want recovered or one they want managed. Is there someone you trust, someone outside the chain that Dillard operates in?" He was quiet for a moment, then, "There's a man named Colonel Garrett Solis. He was my commanding officer for the first 2 deployments. He's been stateside for 3 years, oversight position, technically retired from active command. He's not in Dillard's network." He paused. "If I could get a message to Solis before Dillard gets back in this room." "What do you need? A phone that isn't mine?" He looked at her. "They'll have mine flagged." She looked at him. She looked at her bag on the floor. She looked at the door. Then she reached into her bag and put her personal phone on the mattress beside his hand. He looked at it. He looked at her. "This could get complicated for you." "I noticed," she said. He held her gaze for another second. Then he picked up the phone and she looked at the wall while he dialed, not because she was told to, but because some things deserve their privacy. And whatever Ethan Cross needed to say to Colonel Garrett Solis was not something that required a witness. She heard him speak, low and precise. Not long, 40 seconds, maybe less. A number, a name, a single sentence that she caught the shape of without the words, and then silence. As he listened, and then he set the phone back on the mattress beside her hand without a word. She looked at him. "He'll make contact within the hour," Ethan said, "through the hospital's main line. He'll ask for Dr. Angela Reyes specifically." "Why Reyes?" "Because Solis is careful. He won't call a patient's room directly if he thinks it's being monitored. He'll go through someone with institutional authority." The corner of his mouth moved. "Your Dr. Reyes struck me as someone who doesn't rattle easily." "She doesn't rattle at all," Rowan said. "Good." He exhaled. The exertion of the past 20 minutes was starting to show, not in collapse, but in the particular economy of a man who was managing his own limits with practiced awareness. "Then we wait." Waiting was something Rowan was good at. She had established that the night before. But the quality of this waiting was different from sitting beside an unconscious patient, monitoring a biometric readout. This was the waiting of someone who had stepped into a situation that was still revealing its dimensions, and each new dimension was larger than the last. She reviewed in the silence of the next few minutes what she actually knew. She knew that a man had been in this hospital for 6 days in a condition that had been misread. She knew that she had caught what others had missed. She knew that he was now awake and coherent and in possession of information that at least one federal agent was here to suppress. She knew that his spotter, his partner across 4 deployments, was dead in Virginia. And she knew that whatever was coming through that door next was not going to be simple. She was halfway through that thought when the door opened, and it was not Dillard, and it was not Parrish, and it was not Linda or Okafor or anyone she might have predicted. It was Dr. Preston Harlow. He was in his full professional presentation, white coat badge, the composed authority of a man who had walked into rooms and commanded them for 20 years. He looked at Ethan and he looked at Rowan, and his expression did something that she hadn't seen it do before. It looked uncertain. "Mr. Crossan," he said, "I'm Dr. Harlow, Chief of Medicine. I wanted to come by personally to," he paused, recalibrated, "to speak with you about your care over the past 6 days." Ethan looked at him with an expression of complete neutrality. "All right." Harlow glanced at Rowan. She did not move. "There were some decisions made in your case that in light of new information were not—" He stopped again. She had never seen him stop in the middle of a sentence before. "Your treatment protocol was determined based on the clinical picture available at the time. We now understand that picture was incomplete because of a lab result that was available on day 2, Ethan said. The room was very quiet. Harlow looked at him. The flag was not clearly presented as, "It was in my chart," Ethan said, "and someone missed it for 6 days. "Yes," Harlow said. He said the word like it was something he had to put weight on to keep from rising. "Yes, that is correct." Ethan held his gaze for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm not interested in an apology right now, Dr. Harlow. I'm interested in understanding my current medical situation and making sure that the people who are responsible for my care from this point forward are making decisions based on what's actually true." Harlow nodded, once, stiffly. "Of course. I'd also like Nurse Hale involved in my care going forward, specifically." Another silence. Harlow looked at Rowan. She kept her expression neutral and professional and gave him nothing. "Nurse Hale is on a general rotation," Harlow said carefully. "The assignment of I understand the administrative structure," Ethan said. "I'm telling you my preference. As the patient, patients had the right to request specific nursing staff. It was documented in the hospital's own charter. Harlow knew this. Rowan knew this. Everyone in the room knew this. "I'll have it noted," Harlow said. He left and the door closed behind him, and Ethan looked at Rowan with an expression that was somewhere between dry and exhausted. "He came to see how much I knew," he said, "not to apologize." "Probably both," she said. "You're being generous." "I'm being accurate." She looked at the door. "He made a bad call. He knows it. He'll spend the next 6 months deciding whether that knowledge makes him better or defensive." She paused. "Neither version is your problem right now." His eyes moved to her with something in them that she was beginning to recognize, a directness that wasn't performance, wasn't charm, was simply a man who had long since run out of patience for anything that wasn't real. "You're not what I expected," he said. "You were unconscious when you met me. You didn't have expectations. I'm revising them now." And there it was again, that almost movement at the corner of his mouth, that precursor to something warmer. Then his eyes moved to the door and his expression shifted completely. Because Dillard was back, and this time he had not brought Parrish. He had brought a man in his 60s with silver hair and the particular bearing of someone accustomed to operating well above the room he was currently standing in. Rowan didn't recognize the face, but she recognized the type. She had seen it in hospital administrators, in the men who came to review liability cases, in the people who arrived and after something had already gone wrong to ensure the story was being told correctly. Dillard said, "Mr. Cross, this is Deputy Director Hollis, Directorate of Operations." Hollis didn't wait for a response. He moved to the side of the bed with the ease of someone who had never in his professional life needed to ask for access to a room. He looked at Ethan with an expression that was almost paternal, almost kind, and completely calculated. "Ethan," he said, "I'm relieved to see you awake. We've been concerned." "I'm sure you have," Ethan said. Hollis glanced at Rowan. I need a few minutes with Mr. Cross privately. He's asked me to remain, Rowan said. Hollis looked at her the way powerful men look at people they have determined are not relevant to the situation. Not rudely, but with the particular blankness of someone who has categorized you and moved on. This is a classified. She stays, Ethan said. Hollis redirected his attention to Ethan. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did a recalculation, a reassessment. He pulled a chair from the corner of the room and sat in it, unhurried the way you sit when you want to establish that you're not leaving. I want to talk about Marcus, Hollis said. Ethan said nothing. His death is a significant loss. To the unit, to the program, to me personally. He said it with the smooth grief of someone who had practiced it. The investigation is ongoing, but I want you to hear from me directly that we are pursuing every avenue. What avenue are you currently on? Ethan said. We believe it was connected to the same hostile network that targeted your extraction. You believe that, Ethan said. The evidence points. Marcus called a name on comms, Ethan said, 30 seconds before I went down. You know that because the comms are recorded and those recordings are in the system. So you know exactly what he said and you know whose name he said. And you're sitting in my hospital room telling me you believe it was a hostile network. The silence that followed that was a different kind from any of the ones that had come before it in this room. This one had teeth. Hollis looked at Ethan for a long moment. His expression had not changed, but something behind his eyes had moved a single degree of recalibration, like a man adjusting to a wind shift. You've had significant neurological trauma, Hollis said carefully. Memory fragmentation is common in. I remember exactly what Marcus said, Ethan said. I have remembered it every single hour of the past 6 days, including the hours when everyone in this building thought I wasn't in here. You want to tell me that my memory is compromised, you're going to need a better argument than that. Hollis stood up. The paternal warmth had entirely left his face. What replaced it was not hostility, it was something colder and more professional. The expression of a man shifting from one mode to another with the ease of long practice. Get some rest, he said. We'll continue this when you're stronger. I'm strong enough now. Hollis looked at him one more time. Then he looked at Rowan, really looked at her for the first time since he'd entered the room, and she had the distinct and uncomfortable sensation of being measured for something she didn't yet understand. Then he left, and Dillard followed, and the door swung shut. Ethan exhaled through his nose. Hollis, he said. The name Marcus called. Rowan went very still. I didn't say it directly because this room isn't clean, Ethan said quietly. He glanced up at the ceiling at the standard institutional lighting at the corners where the walls met. The glance was fast and practiced. But Hollis knew the moment I mentioned the comms recording. Watch what happens in the next 20 minutes. What happens in the next 20 minutes? Someone makes a decision about how much of a problem I am. His voice was steady, completely steady. The voice of someone who had been in threat environments before and had learned that panic was the most expensive response. Solace needs to move faster than that. She looked at the phone on her bag strap. She looked at the door. She looked at Ethan. Is there anything in this room that could be used to? She stopped herself. To what? He said. To hurt you that isn't already here. She nodded at the IV line, at the medication port, at the machinery that was still even now managing several of his body's functions. He looked at the IV line. He looked at her. And she watched him arrive at the same place she had just arrived, at the place where what had started as a medical story had completed its transformation into something else entirely. Can you get Okafor? He said. Yes. Now, she was already standing. What do I tell him? Tell him I'd like my medication administration supervised by attending staff only. For the duration of my stay. He held her eyes. He'll understand why if he's as smart as you are. She picked up her bag. She got to the door. She stopped. Ethan, she turned. Solace, what exactly did you ask him to do? He looked at her. I asked him to move. Move what? Everything, he said. Evidence that Dillard doesn't know exists. Recordings Marcus made privately. Off system. Marcus was careful. He was always careful. Something moved through his expression, something that was grief and pride together, the specific texture of mourning. Someone you trusted absolutely. He knew something was coming. He'd been building documentation for 3 weeks before the mission. His jaw tightened. He told me about it the night before we deployed. I told him he was being paranoid. Rowan stood at the door and held the weight of what it meant to be wrong about something that mattered. You couldn't have known, she said. No, he said, but I should have listened. She opened the door. The hallway outside was ordinary. The evening sounds of the floor, the nurse's station 20 feet to her left, the soft traffic of a hospital in its evening rhythm. Everything normal, everything exactly as it should look if someone had decided to make sure it looked that way. She walked to the nurse's station and asked Dennis to page Okafor. She kept her voice level and her face professional, and she did not look back down the hall toward room 14, because looking back was not something the situation had room for. Okafor appeared from the stairwell 4 minutes later, which meant he had been somewhere in the building, which was fortunate. She told him what Ethan had asked for. She told him exactly and only what was necessary. She watched Okafor's face go through several things in rapid succession and then settle into the focused stillness of a man who had already that week demonstrated he was capable of making difficult decisions under pressure. I'll put it in the chart as a patient request, Okafor said. Attending supervised administration only. It's unusual, but it's not without precedent for high-security patients. He looked at her. What exactly are we protecting him from? She held his eyes. I don't know all of it yet, she said, but I know it's real. He nodded, once. I'll be there in 5 minutes. She was walking back toward room 14 when her phone buzzed in her bag. She stopped, pulled it out. The screen showed a number she didn't recognize, not a contact, not a local area code, a number that could have been anywhere. She answered it, a man's voice. Older, precise, not warm but not cold, either the voice of someone who had learned to communicate maximum information in minimum time. Is this the nurse? Yes, she said. He told me about you, said you were the one who kept him in the room. A pause. I need you to know that what happens in the next few hours matters more than you probably understand yet. Can you stay with him? Yes, she said. Whatever comes through that door, regardless of rank, regardless of credentials, nothing changes about his medication protocol without Okafor signing off directly. Can you hold that line? I've been holding lines all night, she said. A breath on the other end that might have been a laugh. Good. I'll have people there within 2 hours. He paused. He's lucky you found him. He found himself, she said. I just paid attention. The call ended. She stood in the hallway for 3 seconds, phone in her hand, and then she put it in her bag and kept walking. Room 14 was 20 feet ahead of her. Inside it, a man who had survived 3 deployments and 6 days of institutional invisibility was awake and fighting a battle that had changed its shape 3 times since she had first sat down in the chair beside him. She pushed the door open. He was looking at the ceiling. He turned when she came in. Okafor's coming, she said, and Solis called. Something moved through his face. Relief was too simple a word for it. It was the specific release of a man who has been operating alone in hostile territory and has just received confirmation that his extraction is real. Timeline, he said. 2 hours. He nodded. He looked at the ceiling again. Then he said without looking at her, when this is over, whatever over looks like, I owe you something I don't know how to pay. You don't owe me anything, she said. She sat down in her chair. She took out her notepad. She found the next line and wrote the time. I was doing my job. You keep saying that because it keeps being true. He looked at her then, and the expression on his face in that moment was something she knew she would carry for a long time, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. The face of a man who had spent a long career in places where nothing was what it appeared to be, looking at someone who was exactly what she appeared to be, and finding that more remarkable than anything he'd encountered in all those years in the dark. Stay close, he said. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Outside the room, the hospital hummed. 2 floors up in a conference room that wasn't on any public directory, a phone call was being made that would within 90 minutes change the shape of everything. Down the hall, Okafor was pulling on his coat and already composing the chart notation in his head. At the nurse's station, Dennis was looking at a visitor log and noticing something in it that didn't quite add up and setting it aside and then picking it back up again. And in room 14, Rowan Hale sat in her chair with her pen in her hand, watching over a man the system had tried to lose, and waited for whatever was coming to come. The first hour passed the way dangerous hours do, not slowly but in compressed bursts of activity separated by stretches of quiet that had too much tension inside them to be called calm. Okafor arrived, reviewed the chart, added the attending supervised notation with the efficiency of a man who had made his decision and was done second-guessing it. He checked Ethan's vitals, adjusted two readings that had drifted in the wrong direction, and said nothing about federal agents or deputy directors or the particular quality of alertness that had settled over room 14 like a change in atmospheric pressure. He was a doctor. He managed what was in front of him. Rowan had always respected that about him, but she respected it more now. Dennis knocked on this door at 9:43. He was holding a visitor log, and his face had the careful expression of someone who has found something and is not sure what to do with it. "There's a notation here," he said, looking at Rowan rather than Ethan. "Visitor signed in at 4:17 this afternoon. Federal ID name logged as Dillard. But there's a second badge scan at the ICU entry point at 9:12 tonight that doesn't match any visitor currently signed in." Rowan looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the door. "Someone's in the building," he said. "Someone who didn't want to sign in this time." Dennis looked between them. "Should I call security?" "Not yet," Ethan said. "Don't do anything that creates noise. Just watch the entry log and tell her if that badge scans again." Dennis looked at Rowan. She nodded. He left, pulling the door mostly closed behind him. Ethan had pushed himself to sitting fully upright. He was not supposed to be doing that. Reyes's orders specified limited positional change for the next 24 hours. But Rowan looked at his face and decided that telling him to lie back down was not a conversation that was going to go anywhere productive. 90 minutes, she said. That is what Solly said. 73 now? He was looking at the door. Whoever scanned that badge is not here for a wellness check. What do they want? He looked at her. The same thing Hollis wanted when he sat in that chair, to know exactly what I remember and how much of it I've already moved. If the answer is that I've moved enough, they have a problem. If the answer is that I haven't moved anything yet, then I'm a problem they can still manage. And which answer is true? Oh, both, he said. Marcus moved it. I just told Solace where to look. She sat with that for a moment. So whoever is in this building tonight already knows about Solace. Maybe. He shifted. His jaw tightened, pain managed and not complained about. Or they're here on a timeline, moving before Solace can move, which means they have less time than I thought. The monitor beeped steadily. The IV drip worked its slow arithmetic. Rowan looked at the medication port and thought about what she'd said to Okafor and what she'd asked Solace in the very specific chain of supervision she had put in place over the past 3 hours, and she felt something cold and clear settle into her, thinking that was not fear exactly, but was adjacent to it, the recognition that the precautions she had taken were real precautions, not abstract ones, and that whoever had scanned that badge understood what was at stake here as well as anyone. Ethan, she leaned forward. If something happens tonight, if someone comes through that door with credentials and paperwork and a very good reason for why your medication needs to be adjusted, what do I do? He looked at her steadily. You make noise, he said. You get Okafor, you get Reyes, you get every nurse on this floor if you have to. You do not let anyone touch that IV line without Okafor's physical signature on a new order. And you do not leave this room. And if they outrank Okafor, nobody outranks the patient's right to refuse, he said. You know that, use it. She did know that. She had known it since her first week of nursing training. It had never before felt like something she would need as a defensive weapon, but the principle was exactly the same. She nodded. He held her eyes for a moment. You understand what you're doing. Right. You understand that you have been in this room with me for the better part of 2 days, and that whatever comes next, whatever inquiry, whatever debrief, whatever questions get asked about who knew what and when, your name is going to be part of that. I know, she said, and you're still here. I'm still here, she said. He didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. He looked at her the way people look at someone when words have reached the end of what they can do, when the only remaining honest response is the fact of continued presence. Then his phone lit up. He looked at the screen. His face changed. Solace, he said, and he answered immediately. She watched his side of the conversation. It was brief and stripped of everything unnecessary, yes, and confirmed and understood, and one question that he asked in a voice so low she couldn't fully hear it, followed by a silence while he listened, followed by a single word that she did hear good. Then he ended the call and looked at her with an expression that had changed in a way she couldn't immediately categorize. Marcus's recordings, he said, Solus has them. All three files, they're all ready with an independent oversight office, not DIA, not D, ODA congressional liaison that Solus has been cultivating for 8 years for exactly this kind of moment. He paused. Hollis can't touch them. Dillard can't touch them. Whatever happens in this room tonight, the documentation is already outside the circle. Rowan felt something release in her chest. Then you're safe. The evidence is safe, he said, which is not always the same thing. He looked at the door. But it's a start. The knock came 7 minutes later. Not Dillard, not Hollis. A man she had never seen before in scrubs that were correct in every detail. The right color, the right badge. Configuration, the right hospital logo. Except that she knew every member of the night nursing staff on this floor by face, and he was not one of them. He was carrying a medication tray, and he moved through the door with the unhurried confidence of someone who had prepared for this specific task. Medication administration for room 14, he said. He looked at Ethan, he looked at Rowan, he looked at the IV port. What medication? Rowan said. She didn't move from the chair. Neurology update to the sedative protocol. Dr. Reyes's order. Dr. Reyes's orders require attending co-signature per this patient's chart notation. She kept her voice completely level. I'll need to see the signed order and contact Dr. Okafor directly for confirmation before any administration. The man looked at her. His expression was patient and professional, and underneath it was something that was not patient and not professional, and she felt it the way you feel weather changing. The order is current, he said. It was signed 30 minutes ago. Then it'll take me 3 minutes to confirm it with Dr. Okafor. You're welcome to wait. He didn't move toward the door. He didn't set the tray down either. He stood in the middle of the room with the medication tray, and he looked at Ethan, and something passed between them. Not words, not a gesture, just the recognition of two people who understood each other's position completely. Ethan said, "She asked you to wait." The man looked at him. He looked at the IV line. He looked at Rowan. And then for one moment that lasted much longer than a moment, the room held a very specific kind of silence. Then Rowan pressed the call button. She held it down, not a single press, a sustained hold, the signal for a floor-level response. Through the door, she heard the change at the nurse's station. Dennis's voice, the sound of the protocol activating. The man in scrubs turned toward the door. He was fast. She had not anticipated how fast. He had the tray in one hand and his other hand was reaching across toward the IV stand, and she was out of the chair before the thought was complete, putting herself between him and Ethan's bedside with the physical conviction of someone who has decided that a line exists and is standing on it. "Don't," she said. He stopped. He looked at her. She was 5'6" and 130 pounds and 7 months into her nursing career, and she was standing between a federal operative and a SEAL sniper's IV line with nothing but her body and her voice and the call button alarm sounding in the hallway, and she did not move. Okafor came through the door 45 seconds later, which felt like 45 years. Behind him was Dennis, and behind Dennis were two hospital security officers who had the particular expression of men who had been told to respond to an alarm and had arrived at a situation more complicated than they were briefed for. Okafor took one look at the tray, one look at the man in scrubs, one look at Rowan still standing between the bed and the intruder. His voice came out with a precision that she had never heard from him before, not loud, not panicked, the voice of a man who has arrived at a situation and made his determination in under 3 seconds. "Security," he said. "I need this individual detained and his credentials verified, now." "Sir, I have authorization from—" "Your authorization is not in the chart," Okafor said, "and the chart is what governs this room. Detain him." The security officers moved. The man in scrubs did not resist. He went with them with the same professional composure he had walked in with, and the tray went with him, and the door swung shut behind all three of them, and the room was quiet. Okafor looked at Ethan, then he looked at Rowan. He said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "Did he touch the line?" "No." He exhaled. He moved to the IV stand and checked every connection with his hands, not just his eyes, methodical and thorough. He checked the medication port. He checked the drip rate. He said nothing until he was satisfied, and then he turned around and said, "Someone is going to explain to me what is happening on this floor tonight, preferably before I have to make another call to Dr. Reyes at 10 o'clock in the evening." Call Reyes, Ethan said, and call this number. He recited a number from memory. Ask for solace. Tell him what just happened. Tell him the timeline needs to move up. Okafor looked at Ethan for a long moment. He was a careful man, careful with his words, careful with his decisions, careful about the distance between what he knew and what he assumed. He had made two significant leaps of faith in the past 24 hours, first when he had come to the floor at 3 in the morning, because a 7-month nurse had a theory, and second when he had put the supervision notation in the chart. He had been right both times. He looked at the number Ethan had given him, and he looked at the door through which the man in scrubs had just been walked out, and he made a third one. "I'll make the call," he said. He left already dialing. Rowan sat back down. Her legs were less steady than they had been before the man in scrubs arrived, and she noticed that from a clinical detachment, the way you notice symptoms in someone else. Adrenaline metabolizing. Normal response. She breathed through it. Ethan was watching her. "You didn't move," he said. "No." "You've done that before. Held a line like that." She looked at him. "I held lines all last night, just quieter ones." He nodded slowly. He was looking at her with something in his expression that had been building across 4 parts of this story and had now arrived fully at the surface. Put the surface, respect deep and unperformed, the kind that doesn't come from a single act, but from watching someone be exactly who they are across a sustained period of difficulty. "I've served with people who froze in situations less intense than what you just did," he said quietly. "I wasn't going to let him touch you," she said. "It was very simple. It was simply true." The next 40 minutes were the fastest of the night. Solis called back. He spoke to Okafor first, then asked for Rowan, and in 2 minutes gave her a specific sequence of instructions that she memorized without writing down, because some things didn't belong on paper. Dr. Reyes arrived on the floor at 10:41 with an expression that suggested she had been doing the same kind of sustained, difficult thing in her own domain that everyone else in Ethan's orbit had been doing in theirs. She reviewed the chart. She reviewed the incident report on the man in scrubs, whose credentials had already been identified as fraudulent by hospital security. She made 3 calls from the hallway. She came back into the room with the look of someone who has stopped being surprised and has moved directly into decisive action. "I've contacted the hospital's legal team and the state medical board's emergency line," she said. "What happened in this room tonight constitutes an attempt to interfere with patient care using fraudulent credentials. That is a criminal matter, and it is now in the hands of people who are not affiliated with any federal directorate." She looked at Ethan. "You're going to be moved to a different room. Right now. The room number will be known only to myself, Dr. Okafor, Nurse Hale, and the charge nurse." "And Solis?" Ethan said. "I'll give him the room number personally," she said, "through a channel he suggested." She paused. "I have worked in this hospital for 11 years. I have navigated difficult administrative situations and difficult patients and difficult families. I have never had a federal operative attempt to access a patient's IV line with fraudulent credentials." She looked at Ethan with the complete directness that was simply her nature. "Whatever you're carrying, Mr. Cross, it had better be worth all of this." "It is," he said. "Then let's move." They moved him at 11:15. Rowan walked beside the bed, her hand close to the rail, watching everything and saying nothing. And Okafor walked on the other side, and Reyes was at the front, and Dennis cleared the hallway with quiet efficiency, and the whole thing took 4 minutes and was from the outside completely unremarkable. Solis arrived at 12:40 in the morning. She had expected someone larger. She didn't know why, perhaps because Ethan had spoken his name with that particular weight, the weight of someone you trust, at the level where trust is no longer a choice, but a fact built across years and circumstance. Garrett Solis was of average height and in his 60s, and he walked into the room with the specific quiet of a man who had been moving through difficult places for a long time and had learned that stillness was its own kind of power. He looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at him. Something passed between them that was older than this room and bigger than this night, and Rowan stood at the side and gave it the space it needed. Then Solis looked at her. "Rowan Hale," he said. "Yes." "You held this man's hand in the dark when everyone else had given up on him," he said. "And then you held a line tonight when someone tried to take him anyway." He said it straightforwardly, the way he seemed to say everything. "I want you to know that what you've done here will be part of the official record of this case. Every bit of it." "I'd rather just know he's safe," she said. Solis nodded. "He will be." The recordings are already in 3 separate hands. The congressional liaison is moving on them now. He looked at Ethan. Hollis is being recalled. Dillard is being cooperated out of the investigation. The 2 men on your team who were arrested, Reyes and Carver, their custody status is being reviewed as of an hour ago. Ethan's jaw shifted. And Marcus. Solis was quiet for a moment. There will be a full investigation, with independent oversight. Everything Marcus documented is going to be seen by the right eyes. He held Ethan's gaze. He made sure of that. Even at the end, he made sure. The room held that for a long moment. Rowan watched Ethan process it, the grief and the gratitude. Together, the weight of a man who had said, "I should have listened," and was now receiving in the most bittersweet way possible. Confirmation that his partner had known exactly what he was doing. "He was always more careful than me," Ethan said quietly. "He trusted you to still be alive, to use what he built," Solis said. He was right. The hours that followed moved with the particular clarity of aftermath. Not calm exactly, but the organized momentum of things moving in the right direction after a long time moving wrong. Okafor documented. Reyes made calls. Solis spent 2 hours on his phone in the hallway, and Rowan could hear the shape of it from inside the room without hearing the words firm direct the sound of someone moving obstacles systematically. At 3 in the morning, she was sitting in the chair beside Ethan's new room when he said, "You should sleep." "Probably," she said. "You're not going to." "Probably not." He looked at the ceiling. She had come to recognize this, his thinking posture, the upward gaze, the stillness, the way his hands rested flat on the blanket when he was processing something large. "When I'm out of here," he said, "when this is done and the inquiry has run its course and I'm not someone's asset or someone's problem anymore, I want to know you." He said it simply. "I want to have a conversation that isn't conducted under these circumstances." She looked at him. "That sounds like it might be a normal conversation." "Something like that." "I've heard those are good," she said. Something moved across his face, a real smile, not the almost movement she had cataloged across the past 2 days, but an actual one, full and unguarded, the face of a man who had been in the dark for 6 days and was now unambiguously back in the light. She smiled back. She hadn't planned to. It just happened the way things happen when you've been holding very hard to something and can finally let your grip soften by 1 degree. At 4:50 in the morning, Dr. Preston Harlow appeared in the doorway of the new room. He was not in his white coat. He was in civilian clothes, which meant he had come back to the hospital voluntarily after hours for a reason that was not administrative. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Rowan. He looked at the documentation on the chair beside her, her notes, her timestamps, the 7 pages of careful observation that had started everything. He came in. He sat in the corner chair, the one Solis had vacated. He was quiet for a long moment. "I was wrong," he said. "No qualification, no clinical hedging, no invocation of the information available at the time. I reviewed your documentation, Nurse Hale, all of it. The pharmacological cross-reference, the enzyme flag, the time-stamped response log." He looked at his hands. "I've been practicing medicine for 22 years. I have made difficult calls, and I have made wrong calls, and I have always believed I knew the difference." He looked up. "I did not know the difference this time, and a patient almost died because of that." The room was quiet. "What are you going to do with that?" Ethan asked. Not combatively, genuinely. Harlow looked at him. "I don't know yet," he said with the honesty of someone who has stopped performing certainty. "But I wanted to say it out loud, to you and to her." He left 20 minutes later. Rowan watched him go. She thought about the versions of that man, the one who had dropped the chart and called a living person already dead, and the one who had just sat in the corner chair and said I was wrong with nothing attached to it. She didn't know which one would show up for work in the morning. She suspected he didn't know either. "He'll be better," Ethan said. "How do you know?" "Because it cost him something to say it. Things that cost something usually mean something." He looked at her. "You know that better than most." She did know it. She thought about 11 hours in a chair, about the pharmacology studies on her phone at 3 in the morning, about standing between a man and an IV line with nothing but her conviction and a call button. It had cost something. She hadn't counted the cost while she was paying it, but she could feel the weight of it now in her bones, in the particular exhaustion that came from caring about something as hard as you were capable of caring. Solis came back inside at 6:15. He said, concisely, the inquiry was formally open. Under independent oversight, the congressional liaison had briefed 3 committee members, And Hollis had made the specific mistake of attempting to access the recordings through official channels, which had created a documented trail that Solace described with visible satisfaction as a gift. "It's done," he said. "Not finished, there's months of work ahead. But done in the sense that matters tonight. The right people have what they need, and the wrong people can no longer reach it." Ethan nodded. He looked at Rowan. She looked at him. Outside the window, the sky was doing the thing it does at 6:15 in the morning, not yet bright, not any more dark, that particular in-between quality of early light that belongs to the hours after a long night and before whatever comes next. Dr. Angela Reyes arrived for rounds at 7 sharp, reviewed Ethan's new chart, declared his trajectory consistent with continued recovery, and before leaving the room, stopped at the door and said without turning, "Nurse Hale, my office, 8 o'clock. I want to talk about your future at this hospital, and I want to do it before anyone else does." She left. Okafor appeared 5 minutes later, reviewed the overnight vitals, and said to Rowan with the directness of someone who had made a decision, "You're being credited with a clinical intervention that changed a patient outcome. I've drafted a formal commendation to nursing administration. It went in 20 minutes ago." She opened her mouth. "Don't argue with me," he said mildly. "You held the line on 6 separate occasions in the past 30 hours. Let someone put it in writing." He left. Rowan sat in the chair. Her chair. She had moved it from room 14 to hear herself at 11:15 in the morning, because some things you just bring with you. Ethan was watching her. He had been doing that with some frequency over the past several hours, and she had stopped being self-conscious about it and had started simply receiving it, the gaze of a man who was looking at someone he wanted to remember exactly as they were. 7 months, he said. "Almost 8, she said. "You're going to be extraordinary," he said. "You already are. But it's going to be something to watch." She looked at her notepad. She found the next line. She wrote the time. Then she set the pen down and looked at him and said, "You're going to be okay. Not immediately, not without a fight, but you're going to be okay." "I know," he said. "How do you know?" "Because I have been in the situations where I wasn't going to be okay," he said. "And they felt different from this. This feels like the morning after." He held her eyes. "You know what the morning after feels like? It feels like you're still here, and you are, and I am. And that's the whole thing." She held that. She turned it over. She let it settle into whatever place inside her was still making room for the things that had happened in this room across the past 30 hours, the accumulating weight of everything she had done and refused to do, and stood between and refused to leave. She had walked into room 14 as a 7-month nurse assigned by a scheduling error to be a patient everyone had already given up on. She had sat down in a chair and paid attention when paying attention was the only thing anyone had left to give. She had held his fingers in the dark and heard his pulse and read the lab flag and faced down a chief of medicine and stood between a man and an Eiffel line and called a colonel she had never met and done every single thing that the situation had asked of her. Not because anyone told her to, and not because she was trained for it, and not because she knew it would work, but because she had looked at a man who was still in there fighting in the only way available to him and decided that someone was going to be in the room when he made it back. She had been right. He had made it back. Some people spend their whole careers in medicine and never get to be the reason. Rowan Hale's 7 months and almost 8 had been the reason, and she had done it in the quietest possible way, with a pen and a notepad and a chair and the absolute refusal to accept that a man was already gone, when every fiber of her told her he was not. Ethan Cross was alive. The evidence was safe. The truth was moving toward the light in the hands of people who would not let it stop. And in room 14, which was now a different room, but would always in the way that mattered be room 14, the woman who had made all of it possible sat in her chair with her pen in her hand and her eyes open and the morning coming through the window. And she was exactly where she had decided to be, which was exactly where she needed to be. And that was the end of the story and the beginning of everything that came after it.